So at the beginning of 2020, the world was struck with this dramatic new challenge called COVID-19, the latest iteration of the coronavirus. It pretty quickly became apparent that it wasn't just your regular flu, something else was going on. It seems to have been sourced in Wuhan in China, and then it really hit the headlines when it landed in Italy. And you might remember the scenes from over a year and a half ago when the Italian public were just traumatized by the level of damage that COVID-19 was doing, and then wasn't long before the rest of the world was in exactly the same boat and were having to deal with this international medical emergency. Now, what did the church do at that point? Well, I think during that phase, any church worth its salt, any pastor or church leaders that were paying attention and doing their job, they were praying. That was part of the deal, that they were praying that God would deliver us from evil, would somehow bring a deliverance from this terrible circumstance, would give an answer to this virus, would equip doctors, scientists, the healthcare community, even governments with the wisdom and the skill that they needed to navigate through this new treacherous water we all found ourselves in. Okay, good prayer. It's the right thing to do. What happened next? Well, the medical and the scientific community, the universities, the research departments, the pharmacologists and the pharmaceutical companies and the experts in their fields all over the world coordinated the single biggest scientific project in history, and they focused like a laser on trying to figure out a vaccine for this virus that the church had been praying would be the case. Then what happens? Well, through all kinds of breakthroughs and trials and tests and then weighing and quantifying the risks and the benefits, we're presented with a number of different vaccine alternatives, which you would think at this point the church would start cheering and saying, yes, Lord, our prayers have been answered because there's a vaccine that's now on the scene, or there's a number of vaccines on the scene, which dramatically lower our risk of catching the disease, getting hospitalized and dying. And so this seems, certainly to me, to be a fairly legitimate answer to our prayers, because that's how God answers prayer, isn't it? Through the human work that He enables us and empowers us and gifts us to do. Now let me just pause and bracket something. Was everybody's motivation at this pure? No. Did the pharmaceutical companies see an opportunity to make a bundle of money? Well, of course they did. You know, did the universities see an opportunity to make a name for themselves? Yes. Did the government see this as an opportunity to tweak policy and maybe up a little bit of control and maneuver some things they've been wanting to get in place? Yeah, no doubt. But was the overall result of this global project by the scientific and medical community progress against this virus? Well, absolutely. So the vaccine arrives. I think a number of people, many of the churches, will say, yes, well done, thank you God, let's get to the front of the queue, do the right thing, try and protect ourselves, protect our community, and we'll receive the vaccine. But alarmingly, there is also a sizable chunk of the evangelical church, certainly in North America, which suddenly jumped back and said, this vaccine's not an answer to prayer. This is another cynical attempt by the nefarious powers that be, by perhaps the governments or Satan or a mixture of the above, to take over the world and to fool us into submission, to give up our rights, to somehow take control of us in a new way. And so the vaccine suddenly became not an answer to prayer, but a symbol of evil. A symbol of something that is against the work of God and the liberties of God's people. In fact, it has been preached by Christian pastors and certainly speculated widely on social media that the vaccine is actually the mark of the beast, a mark of loyalty to the dark and evil powers that are seeking to take over the world. Well, if you know me at all, you know that I would consider that version of events to be, as a pastor or a Christian voice, that is a dereliction of duty to spout that, and it is painful basically non-existent biblical scholarship in order to get to that conclusion. Let's take a really quick look at Revelation chapter 13, which is the only place in the Bible that actually mentions the mark of the beast. In Revelation 13, you have this obscure and cryptic little paragraph about the Antichrist, the false prophet, and then the beast and the mark of the beast, and it would be a mark on the forehead or on the hand that would be very specific. It would be a mark of loyalty and fealty and worship and allegiance to false and ungodly power. And it is the mark is, we're told, the number of a man, and the number is 666. And then it says in the text there in Revelation 13, do the math, calculate the number 666. Well, to understand anything about Revelation chapter 13, you need to understand the general rules of engagement of apocalyptic literature. One of them is the pattern of parody. Now, parody would mean a false and inferior counterfeit. A false and inferior counterfeit. Now, there are many instances and layers of this, but to understand what's happening in 13, you have to go back to Revelation chapter 7. In Revelation chapter 7, we have people being marked with a sign, with a seal on their forehead. Well, what's all that about? Well, that is when God is marking his people. God is sealing his people with his mark. Now, is it something that you could see? Well, no. It's a theological idiom. It's an image of a spiritual reality. Because everything in Revelation is real, but not everything is literal. That's one of the rules of engagement of apocalyptic literature. So in Revelation chapter 7, God is sealing and marking his people. Well, what's all that about? Well, to understand Revelation 7, you've got to go back to Ezekiel chapter 9. In Ezekiel chapter 9, Ezekiel is given a vision of Jerusalem about to be judged, but an angel of the Lord goes through the city and seals and marks the righteous. Okay, how does that work? Well, a seal or a mark is put on their forehead in order to identify them as the people of God. Now, was it an actual tattoo or a branding or some sort of something that was inscribed on them? No, again, it's a spiritual idiom to say these are the people who are loyal to God. And the marking and the sealing is imagery used around that. It also springboards, if you go back further to Deuteronomy chapter 6, Deuteronomy chapter 6 holds the centerpiece of Hebrew theology, which is called the Shema. And the Shema is the declaration that good Jews would make every morning and evening of the truth that they believe, and they would teach it to their family and their children. And the Shema says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. So love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength." It is the center of Hebrew worship. That's what the beast is after in the future. But in Deuteronomy 6, we're also told that not only are they to recite this and to teach each other this, but they're also to bind it to their foreheads and inscribe it or bind it to their hands. So the way to understand Revelation is to understand the Old Testament and the theological techniques and tactics and idioms and metaphors and symbolism that's used all the way through the Old Testament is employed in Revelation. And first century Christians, normally Jewish Christians, knew this. We don't know this, so we are floundering half the time when we're reading Revelation, and we're making stuff up. For example, the mark of the beast is the vaccine. Okay, let's think about the mark of the beast just for a minute. So fast forward all the way from Deuteronomy to Ezekiel to chapter 7 in Revelation, and then go to chapter 13 where it talks about the mark of the beast. The whole book of Revelation, including chapter 13, was not written to 21st century North American evangelicals. Is it beneficial for our lives and can we learn a lot from it? Absolutely. Revelation was written to first century Christians in the ancient Near East, many of whom were suffering horrendous levels of persecution at the hands of their Caesar. When it says in Revelation 13, calculate the number, it's using a standard phrase of what they would have understood to be do gematria. Gematria was a simple technique that was used in Jewish theology to attach a number to every letter of the alphabet. And John uses it to encode something into the Revelation here without saying a specific name. He encodes it in gematria, which was standard practice back then. So, What's the code? Well, if you take Caesar Nero, who was persecuting the church at pathological levels of violence, if you take Caesar Nero, you put it through the Hebrew gematria, where every letter is assigned a number, you come to the conclusion of 666. That is the number of man, the number of the beast for them. Now back then, if they read this, they wouldn't have been in shock and awe at this stunning breakthrough. They would have actually been very comfortable with saying, yeah, that's exactly who it is, and that's exactly what our lives are like. They couldn't live a normal life under Caesar Nero without their loyalty, without their worship going to Caesar. Just like it had been going to God in Deuteronomy, now the parody of Satan wants to take that worship and mutate it towards a false god, towards a man in the place of God. For instance, back then, if you went to the marketplace, to get into the marketplace, you'd have to take a little pinch of incense and drop it over the flame next to the idol or the image of Caesar. And that was symbolic of a prayer of worship and thanksgiving to Caesar, your God, Nero the Lord. So then that means for Christians, suddenly they couldn't buy or sell because they weren't willing to worship a false god. They weren't willing to give their allegiance and their loyalty to this lesser parody of the real God. So they weren't going to make their little incense prayer. So their lives were deeply and significantly affected, and it had dramatic consequence on them. So they were living in Revelation chapter 13, and Nero was their beast. But there's a principle here, that instead of trying to equate a microchip or a barcode with the symbol, the principle of Revelation 13 is not so much about technology. It's that our hearts are rendered to God at all times, that we're not going to follow the way of man and those systems of the world and the sinister evil that is trying to permeate all things, but we're going to give our allegiance to God. And in doing so, we find ourselves marked as God's people, not with a tattoo or a barcode, but with the Spirit, marked with the Spirit, sealed with the Spirit, as exactly as it talks about in Ephesians chapter 1. You have been sealed with the Spirit, who is the deposit guaranteeing what is to come, your inheritance. Now there's a lot more that could be said about this, but when it comes to the voices from amongst the church that are being suspicious against the vaccine and equating it potentially with the mark of the beast, I'd say please just stop talking, because you're doing a lot more harm than good, I think, and you're handling scripture way out of context. And the stakes are not just about a philosophical issue, the stakes are actually life and death for some people. The stakes are a medical emergency on our doorstep, which the church has to take extremely seriously, and I think do the right thing, which is step into that opportunity to embrace that answer to prayer, which I believe it was, and the breakthrough of the medical community to give us this vaccine. Let's do the right thing. Let's look after the widows and the orphans and the marginalized, and make our communities as safe as we possibly can for them by being wise and embracing the grace that God, I think, has afforded us at this moment. So no doubt I'll hear from some of you, and until next time, peace.